Hi there, and welcome to this Explaining History YouTube channel video on the developing technologies of the First World War. Now, before we get looking at tanks and gas, machine guns and artillery and aircraft and all the other inventions that we think of when we think of the First World War, it's worth thinking about why the First World War was such a period of innovation and development in warfare. Wars invariably see technological development, and the reason for this is because normally the circumstances in which wars are fought change. Wars are fought either over different terrain, or armies need to be supplied in different ways, or the way in which two armies are facing one another requires new technologies in order to give either army an advantage. And it's the latter consideration here that's most important when we talk about the First World War. Now, when we talk about the innovation on the battlefield, we need to think for a moment about what the battlefield was like. At the start of the war, the Germans, the French, the Russians, and other European powers all had different mobilization plans. These were the plans that were drawn up long before the war that dictated how armies would move and what their objectives would be and what they would do in the first few weeks of the war. Let's look at Germany's plan, the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan said that because Germany faced Russia in the east and France in the west, France was likely to mobilise more quickly and Russia would take a longer time. Therefore, it made sense to attack France first. And the mobilisation plan saw a quick war against France where the Channel ports would all be seized to stop Britain from landing troops, and then the German army would sweep around and capture Paris. Then they would prepare for a much longer war against Russia, making sure that there were no times where Germany would face a war on two fronts. If Germany has a war on two fronts, she can't win. Germany gets worn down by this kind of a conflict. Now, we know that Germany doesn't beat France quickly because Germany is held up in Belgium, crucially, and then the German army is held up also by a last-ditch attempt by the British Expeditionary Force and the French army to stop Paris from falling, and the German army is stopped at the Battle of the Marne. Because of this, because the German army and the Anglo-French forces essentially balance each other out in terms of manpower and firepower and ability, a long war of position emerges. This is the opposite of a war of movement, which is what the all-powers wanted to have, where you very quickly encircle the enemy's armies and capture their cities and the war's over. Instead, a long, drawn-out war of attrition, where attrition means to wear the other side down, would be fought from 1914 to 1918, and it was exactly the kind of war that generals hadn't really planned for, hadn't expected, and didn't want. The decision was therefore to carry on until some kind of way emerged to break the deadlock. Technology was one of the means by which both sides tried to break the deadlock. In 1915 and 1916, both the British and French on one side and the Germans on the other tried to use set-piece battles such as Verdun and the Somme to destroy the enemy, to finally break the enemy's will and create a breakthrough on the battlefield. In both instances, this was unsuccessful, caused massive casualties on both sides, but was unsuccessful. At the Somme, the British introduced tanks for the first time. These were firstly designed to be infantry support weapons, so that meant that it was something for the infantry to hide behind as they went across no man's land. then it was discovered that tanks had a very useful purpose. Tanks could crush enemy trenches, and they struck fear when they were initially seen into the hearts of the German defenders. So the tank was really a response to the problem of huge numbers of men being mown down by machine gun fire in no man's land in assaults on enemy trenches. The trench system itself is a response to another weapon, artillery. The artillery piece, the cannon, was the biggest killer of the war. Cannon fire was originally not intended to be used in the way that it is used. It was originally thought that if armies were moving around rapidly across Europe, that cannons could be taken with the army and used for firing on specific objectives, used really within the battlefield. Instead, thousands and thousands of cannons are used to rain down artillery shells on enemy trenches. It is designed to be the hammer that breaks the enemy's line. And trenches were created in response to artillery fire. The Russian army on the Eastern Front was badly led and with poor tactics. And the Russian officers didn't build trenches initially at all. Instead, they simply assumed that their men would fling themselves on the floor when cannon shells rained down, with predictably disastrous results. The trench systems were of great interest to either side, and in order to find out how far they went and how deep they were and whether there were any weaknesses within the trench system, aircraft began to be used. Now, if we look at the Royal Flying Corps, which was not a independent part of the armed services of Great Britain, but a subset of the army, the Royal Flying Corps originally used aircraft that brought over from England in 1914, and they were treated with a degree of suspicion by the generals. It was thought that the aircraft were not of a great deal of use, and they were rather scoffed at. As the Royal Flying Corps seems to become more and more useful during the war, more effort and energy is put into it. The job of Royal Flying Corps aircraft was to fly over enemy trenches, take photographs, sometimes drop handheld bombs, though they didn't really have much of a bombing role to begin with, and to find out valuable information to support the ground troops. As the war went on, fighters on either side would fly up to attack spy planes and spotter planes flying over trenches, and over the Western Front, dogfights would soon emerge, particularly after the invention of synchronized machine gun fire, which was first invented by the Germans and meant that fighter planes could have front-facing machine guns that would fire through the propellers and shoot down the enemy. This was a really important innovation because it meant that a pilot could have a far better shot. Previously, pilots would simply use sidearms of a pistol or a rifle to shoot at the enemy, though obviously piloting a plane and shooting at another plane is quite a tricky skill. By the end of the war, both sides have developed bombers. In 1918, a fleet of German Gotha bombers flew over London and really initiated the first blitz against London. These were large four-engine bombers that were capable of carrying quite a payload. The aircraft after the First World War would develop in significance, and the Royal Flying Corps would eventually become the RAF. And the lesson that was learned from the First World War that was applied in the Second World War is that the side that controls the airspace really wins the battle. Because of the deadly effect of machine gun fire in the trenches, other ways had to be sought to destroy the enemy's resolve and the enemy's morale, to hold their position. And this was one of the reasons why poison gas starts to be used, first by the Germans and then by all sides during the war. Initially, chlorine gas was used, and then scientists on both sides set about creating deadlier gases, such as phosgene gas and mustard gas. The popular image of men blinded by gas is perhaps slightly misleading. In most cases, the eyesight returned. One particular point in case would be Adolf Hitler, who was blinded by British gas in 1918, but whose eyes recovered after a few months of hospitalisation. The more long-term damage that soldiers endured was an attack on their respiratory system. The lining of the lungs would dissolve and men would develop large amounts of fluid in their lungs, which would eventually drown them. And this was one of the many reasons why gas was a feared and terrifying weapon, and it had the designed effect of causing retreats and causing men to flee the trenches, and enabling mass attacks to take place with little opposition. The other major impact on the health of soldiers, one of the many, was shell shock. A shell shock was an previously unrecorded psychological and physical phenomena where men would begin to lose their nerves under endless shell fire. Partly this had to do with the vibrations in the fluids within the brain and the spinal cord, causing the body to involuntarily shake. But also it was a mental illness akin to a nervous breakdown or extreme stress or panic due to endless artillery shells. And men were unable to function. 300 were executed by the British. It was assumed they were cowardly or refusing to fight. But gradually, during the war, advances in the medicine of psychiatry, particularly at a Scottish Army hospital in Edinburgh called Craiglockhart, where the war poet Siegfried Sassoon was sent, began to diagnose this phenomena of shell shock, and a more understanding towards the soldiers towards the end and after the war developed. The other infamous condition of the trenches was the foot disease trench foot, which is a fungal infection that seeped into the feet of soldiers after they were in waterlogged trenches for days and weeks on end, and caused the feet to swell up and become gangrenous. It was when the feet dried out that it became unbearably and agonisingly painful. Though for a lot of the time the trenches were places of not of panic and fear, but of extreme boredom. The soldiers were on sentry duty for hours on end, or they spent time in the trenches writing, sketching, playing cards, or doing essential work like building new trenches and rebuilding old ones, and then there would be preparation for an attack or patrols into no man's land. So it's periods of boredom punctuated by fear and danger.